There are places in America where history stops, where time itself seems to pause at a specific moment, forever frozen around a single event so terrible that everything before becomes prologue and everything after becomes epilogue. Villisca, Iowa is one of those places. A small farming community in the southwestern corner of the state, nestled between two rivers in rolling hills of corn and soybean fields. Population in 1912, approximately 2,500. A place where everyone knew everyone, where doors were left unlocked because locks were unnecessary, where children played in the streets until dark and walked to church on Sunday mornings in their finest clothes. The name Villisca was believed to mean pleasant view or pretty place in the language of the area's original Native American inhabitants, the Sac and Fox tribes, though some historians now suggest the founder may have confused it with a different word, Waliska, which meant evil place. Either way, by the early 20th century, Villisca had earned its reputation as one of the finest small towns in Iowa. The 1912 Iowa Touring Atlas described it as perfectly picturesque, with lovely Victorian homes lining tree-shaded streets, with a thriving business district centered around a town square, with churches and schools and all the infrastructure of American progress. The town had been platted in 1858 by D.N. Smith of the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad, established at a strategic position between the Middle and West Nottoway rivers. What began as a settlement called the Forks had grown into a prosperous community that represented everything Americans aspired to in that era. Hard work rewarded with success, neighbors you could trust, a place to raise children in safety and security. The kind of town where a handshake meant something, where your word was your bond, where everyone looked out for everyone else. More than 24 passenger and freight trains stopped at the depot each day. The Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad had chosen Villisca as a coveted stop on their line, and that designation promised continued growth and prosperity. There were hotels where traveling salesmen could find clean rooms and hot meals, restaurants where farmers could gather over coffee and discuss crops and weather and the price of livestock, stores selling everything from fabric and flour to farm implements and hardware, theaters where families could watch traveling shows and moving pictures, that new marvel of technology, manufacturers providing jobs and bringing money into the local economy. The town even boasted Iowa's first and only publicly funded armory, constructed in 1912 on the north side of the square. Company F, Villisca's military unit, represented the community's patriotism and readiness to serve the nation. Everything about Villisca suggested a community with a bright future stretching out before it like the farmland that surrounded the town in every direction. Cornfields and wheat fields rolling away to the horizon, rich soil that produced abundant harvests. Land that had drawn settlers westward and rewarded them with prosperity. On Sunday evening, June 9, 1912, that future ended. The day had been typical for a small Iowa town in early summer. Church services in the morning, Sunday dinner with family, and in the evening, a special Children's Day program at the Presbyterian Church. Children's Day was an annual event, a celebration marking the end of the Sunday school year. The children performed recitations and little speeches they had memorized, sang songs, showed their parents what they had learned. It was wholesome, communal, exactly the kind of event that defined small-town American life in that era. Among the families attending was the Moores. Josiah Moore, known as Joe to everyone in town, was 43 years old. He was a success story, the kind of man who embodied the American dream. Born in 1869 to a local family, he'd grown up in Villisca and learned the hardware trade from the ground up. He'd worked for Frank F. Jones, one of the town's most prominent businessmen, for 7 years, becoming the star salesman of Jones's farm implement business. But Joe Moore had ambitions beyond working for someone else. In 1907, he'd struck out on his own, establishing a competing business selling John Deere farm equipment. The move had required courage and capital, and it had paid off. By 1912, Moore's business was thriving. He was known throughout the farming community as honest and fair, someone who stood behind the products he sold and treated customers with respect. His wife, Sarah Montgomery Moore, was 39. She had married Joe in 1899 at her parents' home, and together they'd built a life that by all accounts was happy and stable. Sarah played piano at the Presbyterian church, her fingers moving across the keys during Sunday services, filling the sanctuary with hymns. She was known throughout the community as an excellent housekeeper, a woman who took pride in her home and her children. Her father would later testify that Sarah kept everything tidy, that she saw to it her children went to Sunday school every week, that she and Joe seemed genuinely affectionate with each other. In an era when marital discord was whispered about but rarely discussed openly, the Moores appeared to be truly content. If they had problems, they kept them private, presenting to their community the image of a solid, loving marriage. They had 4 children. Herman Montgomery Moore, age 11, the eldest son carrying his mother's maiden name as his middle name, a tradition in many families of that era. Mary Catherine Moore, age 10, known simply as Catherine, a girl who loved having friends over and who had asked that Sunday if the Stillinger sisters could spend the night. Arthur Boyd Moore, age 7, full of the energy and curiosity that characterizes boys that age. And Paul Vernon Moore, age 5, the baby of the family, still young enough to be doted on by his parents and older siblings. By all accounts, the Moores were happy. Sarah's father, John Montgomery, would later tell investigators that he saw no problems in the marriage, that Joe and Sarah were affectionate, that they visited the Montgomery farm regularly, bringing the children for Sunday afternoon visits. The family attended church faithfully. They participated in community events. They were prosperous without being ostentatious, successful without being arrogant. The embodiment of what people imagined when they thought about wholesome American values. They were, in every way, the kind of family that any small town would be proud to claim as their own. That Sunday evening, Mary Moore asked if 2 friends could spend the night. Lena Gertrude Stillinger, age 12, and her younger sister Anaimi Stillinger, age 8. The girls came from a wealthy farming family that lived about 7 miles outside of town. They had participated in the Children's Day program that evening and were dressed in their good clothes, starched cotton dresses, excited by the special occasion. Around 6 p.m., Josiah Moore called the Stillinger home and spoke with their older sister, Blanche, asking if the girls could stay overnight. Permission was granted. The Children's Day service ended sometime after 9 p.m. There was socializing afterward, people mingling in that unhurried way that characterizes small-town gatherings where everyone knows everyone and there's no pressing need to rush home. Eventually, around 9:30 or perhaps closer to 10 p.m., the Moore family and the 2 Stillinger girls began the short walk home. It was only 3 blocks from the church to the Moore house at 508 East 2nd Street. A cloudy evening, cool and damp, with just enough light from windows and distant stars to see the familiar path. They arrived home. The house was modest by today's standards but comfortable for 1912, a white-framed structure built in 1868, expanded over the years to about 1,400 square feet. 2 bedrooms upstairs where the parents and the 4 Moore children slept. A parlor bedroom downstairs where the Stillinger girls would spend the night. A kitchen, a dining room, living space. Everything a middle-class family needed. What happened next can only be reconstructed from the evidence left behind, from the crime scene that would be discovered the following morning, from the investigations and theories and speculation that would consume the town for years to come. Somewhere around midnight, perhaps earlier, perhaps later, someone entered the house. The back door was unlocked. In Villisca in 1912, that was normal. People didn't lock their doors. There was no need. This was a safe town, a good town, a place where neighbors looked out for each other and strangers were noticed, and crime was virtually non-existent. The intruder moved quietly. He took an oil lamp from a table near the door and adjusted it to burn very low, providing just enough light to see by without being visible from outside. In his other hand, he carried an axe, Joe Moore's axe, taken from the woodshed or the coal shed outside. The killer knew the layout of the house, or moved through it with remarkable confidence given the darkness. He went upstairs first, guided by the dim lamp, stepping carefully on stairs that would have creaked under weight. He entered the master bedroom where Josiah and Sarah Moore were sleeping. What happened next was an explosion of violence so extreme that it defied comprehension. The killer struck Josiah Moore first, bringing the axe down on his head as he slept. Then again, and again, and again. The autopsy would later determine that Josiah received more than 30 blows to the head and face. The force of the strikes was so great that it left marks on the ceiling and walls, spatter patterns that told a story of frenzied, methodical brutality. His face was obliterated. His eyes were gone. The killer continued striking long after death was certain, reducing Josiah's skull to fragments, making identification by facial features impossible. Sarah Moore was killed in the same manner. Fewer blows than her husband, but the same savage intensity. The same destruction of the face, the same evidence of rage or compulsion or whatever drove the killer to continue striking defenseless victims long after they were dead. From the parents' room, the killer moved to the adjacent bedroom where the 4 more children slept: Herman, Mary, Arthur, and Paul. The oldest was 11. The youngest was 5. There is no evidence that any of them woke up before they died. The killer struck each child in the head with the axe, crushing their skulls as they slept. Their faces, like their parents', were destroyed by repeated blows. The bedclothes were soaked with blood. The walls bore marks where the axe had struck with such force that it continued past the victims' bodies. Then the killer went downstairs to the parlor bedroom where Lena and Ine Stillinger were sleeping. Lena, age 12, may have awakened at the last moment. There were defensive wounds on her arm, suggesting she raised it instinctively as the axe descended. It made no difference. Both girls were killed in the same manner as the Moore family: faces destroyed, skulls crushed, bedding soaked in blood. 8 people, 8 defenseless human beings, 6 of them children, murdered in their sleep with an axe. And then the killer did something that transformed this from simply a brutal crime into something far more disturbing. He stayed in the house, not fleeing in panic, not running from the horror he had created, but remaining, moving through the rooms, covering all the mirrors in the house with cloth or items of clothing. This was a practice common during wakes and funerals in that era, a superstition about mirrors trapping souls or reflecting the deceased. But what did it mean that the killer took the time to do this? He covered the victims' faces with cloths or pieces of clothing. He pulled the bedclothes up over the bodies, as if tucking them in for sleep. These gestures could be read as remorse, as some twisted form of care, or as further ritual. There's no way to know. He closed all the window blinds. On windows without blinds, he draped pieces of the family's clothing to block the view from outside. He wanted to ensure no one would see in, that the house would reveal nothing until he was ready. In the kitchen, investigators would later find 2 slices of raw bacon laid out on the floor, food partially eaten and abandoned on the table. In the attic, cigarette butts. The evidence suggested the killer had spent considerable time in the house before the murders, waiting for the family to fall asleep. And considerable time after, moving through the rooms, completing whatever ritual or compulsion had driven him to this act. When he finally left, he placed the axe in the downstairs bedroom where the Stillinger girls lay dead, leaning it against the wall as if the job was finished and the tool no longer needed. The next morning, Monday, June 10, 1912, began like any other in Villisca. People rose early. Farmers headed to their fields. Merchants opened their stores. And Mary Peckham, the Moore family's neighbor, noticed something wrong. The Moore family always rose early. Josiah was punctual, reliable, the kind of man who adhered to routines. But this morning, there was no activity at the Moore house. The chickens hadn't been let out. No one was stirring. Around 7 a.m., Peckham knocked on the door, no answer. She tried to open it and found it locked from the inside. This was unusual but not alarming. She let the Moore's chickens out herself and then called Ross Moore, Josiah's brother. Ross came immediately. He knocked, shouted his brother's name, received no response. Using his copy of the house key, he unlocked the door and entered. The house was dark. All the blinds were closed, the windows covered. He could see shapes in the dimness but couldn't make sense of what he was seeing. He called out. Silence. He moved toward the parlor and opened the guest bedroom door. In the faint light, he saw the Stillinger girls on the bed. He saw blood. He saw enough to know something terrible had happened. He immediately went back outside and told Peckham to call Hank Horton, Villisca's town marshal, the primary peace officer. Horton arrived shortly thereafter. He entered the house and began searching room by room. The parlor bedroom with the Stillinger girls, the kitchen, the upstairs bedrooms. In each room, more bodies, more blood, More evidence of violence so extreme it seemed impossible. 8 people, all dead, all murdered with an axe, all struck in the head with such force that their faces were unrecognizable. Word spread through Villisca with the speed that only small towns can achieve. Telephone calls placed through the local operator. People running from house to house, knocking on doors, spreading the news in voices that grew shriller with repetition. By mid-morning, hundreds of people had gathered at the Moore house. And this is where the investigation began to go catastrophically wrong. There was no concept of crime scene preservation in rural Iowa in 1912. No training in forensic procedures. No understanding of how easily evidence could be contaminated or destroyed. The house was treated not as a crime scene, but as a public spectacle, a horror show that the townspeople had a right to witness. People walked through the house, touching things, moving items, picking up objects to examine them more closely. Curious townspeople wandered from room to room, looking at the bodies where they lay, pointing out details to each other, standing in pools of blood that their footprints then tracked throughout the house. The reasons were understandable, if misguided. This was their community. These were their neighbors, their friends, their fellow church members. The Moores weren't strangers. They were people everyone knew. Joe Moore had sold farming equipment to half the men now crowding into his house. Sarah Moore had played piano at services where half the women now standing in her bedroom had sung hymns. The children had attended school with the children of the people now staring at their bodies. In the absence of professional law enforcement, in the absence of any framework for handling such an unprecedented tragedy, people reverted to what felt natural. They came to see, to bear witness, to try to understand the incomprehensible. Reporters arrived from Des Moines, from Omaha, from as far away as Chicago. The story was spreading beyond Villisca, becoming national news. Photographers were hired to document the scene, to capture images that would help investigators understand what had happened. But those photographs, if they still exist, have been lost or mislaid in the intervening years. What we're left with are written descriptions, testimony from those who saw the scene before it was cleaned, accounts from the doctors and coroner who tried to make sense of the carnage. By the time County Coroner Dr. Lindquist and a team of doctors arrived to conduct their examination, the scene had been hopelessly compromised. They did their best. They measured the rooms, noted the positions of the bodies, examined the wounds, attempted to determine a timeline. They determined that the murders had taken place between midnight and 5 a.m. They noted the pattern of injuries, the use of the axe that had been left at the scene, the deliberate covering of mirrors and windows, the cloths placed over the victims' faces. They observed that Josiah Moore had received more blows than any other victim, more than 30 strikes to the head and face, suggesting either special rage directed at him or simply that he was the first victim, and the killer was working out the frenzy before moving on to the others. But so much evidence had been destroyed by the crowds. Footprints that might have belonged to the killer were now lost among hundreds of other footprints. Items that might have been deliberately placed by the killer had been moved by curious hands. The crime scene, which should have been preserved in its exact state for careful documentation, had been transformed into chaos. Potential clues were lost forever, trampled or touched or carried away by souvenir hunters who didn't understand what they were destroying. The funeral was held on June 12, 1912, 2 days after the bodies were discovered. Thousands of people attended. National Guardsmen had to block the street as the hearse moved toward the firehouse where the 8 victims lay in their caskets. The caskets were not opened for viewing. The condition of the bodies made that impossible. The funeral cortege was 50 carriages long, winding through the streets of Villisca to the cemetery where the victims were laid to rest. The Moore family buried together. The Stillinger sisters beside them. 8 graves, 8 lives ended on a single night, in a single house, by a killer who had vanished without a trace. The investigation that followed was massive by the standards of rural Iowa in 1912. Special agents were brought in. Detectives from private agencies arrived, some hired by the victims' families, some working for the state. The Burns Detective Agency, one of the most famous investigative firms of the era, became involved. Theories multiplied. Suspects emerged. And for the next several years, Villisca became consumed by the search for answers that would never be found. The first suspect to emerge was Reverend George Kelly. Lynn George Jacqueline Kelly was an English immigrant, a traveling minister who had been in Villisca on the day of the murders. He had attended the Children's Day program at the Presbyterian Church. He had been seen watching the Moore family. And crucially, he left town very early on the morning of June 10, departing on the 5:19 a.m. train, even before the bodies were discovered. Kelly was a peculiar man. He had a history of mental illness, having suffered a breakdown as a young man. He was known to be a voyeur, accused multiple times of peeping in windows and asking young women and girls to pose nude for him under various pretexts. He was left-handed, and blood spatter analysis suggested the killer was left-handed. And according to witnesses, Kelly had told fellow train passengers that morning that 8 people were dead in Villisca, butchered in their beds, even though the bodies hadn't been discovered yet. Kelly would later be questioned extensively. Under pressure, he signed a confession. Then he recanted. He claimed he had heard sounds during the night, that he might have witnessed something that he couldn't remember clearly. His mental state made him both a compelling suspect and an unreliable one. Was he confessing because he was guilty, or because he was mentally ill and susceptible to suggestion? The authorities couldn't be sure. Kelly was tried twice for the murders. The first trial in 1917 ended in a hung jury. The second trial, later that same year, ended in acquittal. The evidence against him was circumstantial. His confession was dubious. His small stature and meek personality made some doubt he could have committed such brutal murders. But he was never completely ruled out, and many in Villisca believed until their deaths that Kelly was the killer who got away. The second major suspect was Frank F. Jones, a prominent Iowa state senator and businessman. Jones had employed Josiah Moore for 7 years in his farm implement business. Moore had been his star salesman. But in 1907, Moore had left Jones's employment and set up as a direct competitor, taking the valuable John Deere account with him. Jones was known to hold grudges. He was also rumored to be furious with Moore for another reason. Moore was believed to have had an affair with Jones's daughter-in-law, a local beauty whose indiscretions were well known in town. By 1912, the animosity between Jones and Moore had grown so intense that the two men would cross the street to avoid each other. In a town as small as Villisca, that was a dramatic public display of hatred. But Jones was 57 years old, a respected politician. Few believed he would have committed the murders himself. The theory was that he hired someone to do it. James Wilkerson, an agent of the Burns Detective Agency, became convinced that Jones had hired a man named William Mansfield to murder the Moore family. Mansfield had the right background for such work. He was a drifter, a violent man, a prime suspect in multiple other axe murders. In 1914, Mansfield became the chief suspect in the axe murders of his own wife, her parents, and his child in Blue Island, Illinois. The similarities to the Villisca murders were striking. The use of an axe, the destruction of the victims' faces, the methodical brutality. Wilkerson pursued the Jones-Mansfield theory relentlessly. He gathered enough evidence to have a grand jury convened. He made enough noise to derail Jones's attempts at re-election to the state Senate, effectively ending his political career. But ultimately, the evidence was insufficient. Mansfield had alibis that placed him elsewhere during some of the murders. The connections were suggestive but not definitive. The grand jury declined to indict. And Frank F. Jones, his reputation destroyed, lived the rest of his life under a cloud of suspicion, never charged but never cleared. A third suspect emerged in the form of Henry Lee Moore, a man who bore no relation to the Josiah Moore family despite sharing the surname. Henry Lee Moore was convicted of murdering his mother and grandmother with an axe in Columbia, Missouri, in December 1912, just 6 months after the Villisca murders. He was suspected of being a serial killer responsible for multiple axe murders across the Midwest. The crimes attributed to him showed eerie similarities. Families killed in their sleep, faces obliterated, a ritualistic quality to the violence. In recent years, authors and researchers have proposed that the Villisca murders were part of a much larger series of crimes committed by a single serial killer. Between 1898 and 1912, dozens of families across the Midwest were murdered in their homes by an axe-wielding assailant. The pattern was consistent. families living near railroad lines, murders committed at night while victims slept, faces destroyed beyond recognition, windows and mirrors covered. The use of an axe, often taken from the victim's own property. The first crime in the series occurred in September 1911 in Colorado Springs, Colorado. During the night of September 17 to 18, 2 families were murdered in separate houses. The Burnham family, May Alice Burnham, age 35, and her 2 children, Nellie, 7, and John, 2. The Wayne family, Henry F. Wayne, 24, his wife Blanche, 22, and their 18-month-old daughter Lula. Both families had come to Colorado Springs to visit the local sanatorium run by the Modern Woodmen of America. While the men stayed at the sanatorium for treatment, their wives and children lived in nearby cottage-style houses. The murders were discovered on the morning of September 20. In both cases, all the victims had their skulls crushed with the blunt side of an axe. Their faces were covered with bed sheets. The windows had been covered to prevent anyone from seeing inside. The similarities to what would later happen in Villisca were already apparent. The use of an axe, the targeting of entire families, the destruction of faces, the covering of windows, the proximity to railroad lines. The crimes occurred in the dead of night, with the killer entering through unlocked doors, moving through the houses with apparent confidence, completing the murders without waking neighbors or attracting attention. A few weeks after Colorado Springs, a family was murdered in Monmouth, Illinois. Then came Ellsworth, Kansas, where the Showman family was killed in circumstances nearly identical to the Colorado Springs murders. The pattern paused during the winter months, when traveling by rail would have been more difficult and more noticeable, but it resumed in the summer of 1912. In June, the Hudson family was slain in Paola, Kansas, just 4 days before the Villisca murders. The parallels were impossible to ignore. In 2017, authors Bill James and Rachel McCarthy James published The Man from the Train, arguing that as many as 90 deaths could be attributed to this single killer, operating across 14 years. They identified the murderer as Paul Mueller, also known as Paul Miller, a German immigrant who worked as an itinerant laborer, traveling from town to town by rail, finding work as a farmhand or day laborer, then moving on before anyone could connect him to the crimes that occurred in his wake. Mueller was the primary suspect in the 1897 murder of a family in West Brookfield, Massachusetts. But he disappeared before he could be apprehended. The theory is compelling because of how well the pieces fit. An itinerant railroad worker in that era could travel extensively without arousing suspicion. Drifters and laborers were common. They arrived by train, worked for a few days or weeks, moved on to the next town. No one kept track of them. No one knew their real names or where they came from or where they were going. They lived in a kind of social invisibility, noticed only when they were needed for work, forgotten as soon as they left. For a serial killer, it was the perfect cover. Move into a town, identify a target family living near the railroad tracks, wait for the right opportunity, commit the murder, leave on the next train. By the time the bodies were discovered, the killer was already in another state. The Villisca murders fit this pattern perfectly. The town was a major railroad hub with trains arriving and departing dozens of times each day. The Moore house was only a few blocks from the depot. A stranger could have arrived on an evening train, observed the family at the church program, waited for them to return home and fall asleep, committed the murders, and departed on a morning train before the bodies were discovered. In a town where dozens of unfamiliar faces passed through every day, one more stranger wouldn't have been noticed or remembered. The extreme violence, the specific targeting of faces, the covering of windows and mirrors, all matched other crimes in the series. But like all theories about the Villisca murders, this one remains unproven. Mueller was never caught, never definitively linked to any of the crimes. If he was the Villisca killer, if he was responsible for as many as 90 deaths across the Midwest, he took that secret to his grave. The man from the train, if he existed, was never identified, never apprehended, never brought to justice. He simply vanished into history, leaving behind only a trail of slaughtered families and questions that will never be answered. The investigation continued for years. Other suspects emerged and were dismissed. Andrew Sawyer, a man who was obsessed with the murders and slept with an axe by his bed, was questioned but had an alibi. He had been arrested for vagrancy in another Iowa town the night of the murders. Henry Lee Moore, the convicted killer, was investigated but never definitively linked to Villisca. Various transients and strangers who had passed through town were questioned and released. Psychics were consulted. Rumors spread. The town split into factions, some believing Kelly was guilty, others convinced it was Mansfield acting on Jones's orders, still others suspecting a random drifter who would never be identified. The Josiah Moore house stood empty for years after the murders. No one wanted to live in a place where such horror had occurred. The property changed hands multiple times over the decades that followed. Some owners tried to live there and left quickly, claiming financial problems or unease with the history. The real estate listings rarely mentioned what had happened there, but in a town as small as Villisca, everyone knew. You couldn't not know. The murders were part of the town's identity, part of its collective memory, passed down from generation to generation. Local legend suggested the house was cursed. Stories circulated about strange occurrences. Lights seen in windows when no one was home. Sounds of footsteps on the stairs. The feeling of being watched. Whether these stories were true or simply the natural result of a building with such a dark history is impossible to say. The human mind, confronted with a place where terrible violence occurred, tends to create narratives that make sense of the unease we feel. We attribute our discomfort to ghosts, rather than to our own knowledge of what happened there. The house fell into disrepair. Paint peeled, boards warped. The structure that had once been a respectable middle-class home became shabby, neglected, a physical embodiment of the tragedy that had occurred within its walls. Some townspeople wished it would simply be torn down, erased from the landscape, allowing the community to move forward without the constant reminder. But demolition never happened. The house remained, slowly deteriorating, a monument to unanswered questions. In the 1990s, Darwin and Martha Lynn purchased the property with a specific vision. They saw the house not as something to be destroyed, but as something to be preserved. They undertook an extensive restoration, a project that required significant time, money, and dedication. They removed all modern renovations that had been added over the years. They replaced fixtures and furnishings with period-appropriate items, researching what a middle-class Iowa home in 1912 would have contained. They even left the house without electricity or running water to match its state on the night of the murders, creating as accurate a recreation as possible of the environment in which the crimes occurred. The restoration was meticulous, almost obsessive in its attention to detail. The Lynns consulted historical photographs, reviewed floor plans, interviewed elderly Villisca residents who remembered what the house had looked like before the murders. They wanted visitors to experience the house not as it had become over the decades, but as it had been on June 9, 1912. To stand in the same rooms where the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters had stood. To climb the same stairs the killer had climbed. To see the same layout, the same narrow hallways, the same small bedrooms where 8 people had died. In 1994, the house was opened as a museum. It has since become one of Iowa's most visited historic sites and a pilgrimage destination for true crime enthusiasts and paranormal investigators. People come from around the world to tour the rooms where 8 people were murdered, to stand in the spaces where violence unfolded, to try to understand what happened that night. The house offers overnight stays for those brave or curious enough to spend a night in the murder house. There is never a shortage of interested parties. The story of what happened in Villisca on the night of June 9 to June 10, 1912, is a story without an ending. 112 years have passed, and we are no closer to knowing who killed the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters than the investigators were in the days immediately following the murders. Every suspect has been investigated and found wanting. Every theory has holes. Every piece of evidence can be interpreted multiple ways. What we're left with are questions. Was it Reverend Kelly, a mentally unstable voyeur who confessed and recanted? Was it William Mansfield, a violent drifter hired by a vengeful businessman? Was it Henry Lee Moore, a serial killer whose crimes bore striking similarities to Villisca? Was it Paul Mueller, the mysterious man from the train who possibly killed dozens of families across the Midwest? Or was it someone else entirely, someone whose name never emerged, who committed this atrocity and disappeared into history without leaving a trace. We know the how in gruesome detail. The axe, the blows, the destruction of the victims' faces, the careful covering of windows and mirrors, the time spent in the house both before and after the murders. We know the when, sometime between midnight and 5 a.m. on June 10, 1912. We know the who of the victims: Josiah Moore, 43, Sarah Moore, 39, Herman Moore, 11, Mary Moore, 10, Arthur Moore, 7, Paul Moore, 5, Lena Stillinger, 12, Inez Stillinger, 8. We know the where: a modest white house at 508 East 2nd Street in Villisca, Iowa. What we don't know, what we will likely never know, is why. What drove someone to commit such an act? What rage or compulsion or psychological fracture led to the methodical murder of 8 people, 6 of them children, in their sleep? And who was capable of not just killing but of staying afterward, moving through the house in darkness, covering mirrors, arranging bodies, completing whatever ritual the murders represented? The town of Villisca carries this weight still. The murders define the community in ways both visible and invisible. For years, the case split the town. People took sides on suspects, argued about theories, harbored suspicions about neighbors. The trials of Reverend Kelly brought national attention and divided opinions. Frank F. Jones, once a respected senator, saw his career destroyed by accusations he could never shake. Families of the victims lived with grief that had no resolution, no justice, no closure. And there's a broader question the Villisca murders raise, one that goes beyond the specifics of this case. How do we process unsolved horror? How do we live with the knowledge that sometimes terrible things happen and we never find out why? That sometimes the person who commits the worst crime imaginable simply vanishes, never caught, never punished, never even identified. It violates our sense of order, our belief that justice ultimately prevails, our need for narratives to have endings. The Villisca murders remain one of the most brutal unsolved crimes in American history. 8 people, killed in a single night, in a single house, in a town so small that everyone knew everyone. And the killer walked away, got on a train, perhaps, or walked down a dark road out of town, or went back to his own house in Villisca and lived among the people he had terrorized, hiding in plain sight. We don't know. We may never know. What we do know is that Villisca changed that night. The pleasant view became a darker landscape. The safe small town where doors were left unlocked learned that safety is an illusion. The community that prided itself on knowing everyone discovered that you can never truly know what someone is capable of until the moment they reveal it. And by then, it's too late. The house still stands at 508 East 2nd Street. Visitors walk through the rooms, stand in the spaces where the murders occurred, try to imagine what happened in the darkness of June 10, 1912. Some report feeling presences, hearing sounds, experiencing sensations they can't explain. Whether that's the victim's spirits or simply the power of suggestion operating on people who know the history is impossible to say. What's undeniable is that the house holds something. Memory, perhaps. The weight of what happened there. The knowledge that 8 innocent people went to sleep in safety and never woke up. Villisca, Iowa, population now around 1,100, continues on. It's still a farming community, still defined by its agricultural heritage, still recognizable as a small American town. But it will forever be the place where 8 people were murdered and no one was ever held accountable. The pleasant view is shadowed by a question that hangs over the town like the clouds that hung over it on the night of June 9, 1912. Who did this? And why? We may never have answers. The people who could have provided them, if they existed, are long dead. The evidence has deteriorated or been lost. The memories have faded. What remains is the story, told and retold, examined from every angle, picked apart by historians and amateur detectives and true crime enthusiasts who believe that if they just look hard enough, think carefully enough, they'll find the clue everyone else missed. The piece of evidence that will finally solve the mystery. But 112 years is a long time. Long enough that hope of resolution has faded to acceptance that some questions don't have answers. Some mysteries don't get solved. Some killers don't get caught. And sometimes, in small towns with dark secrets, the darkness wins. If you've listened this far, you've spent time in a house where unspeakable horror unfolded more than a century ago. You've walked through rooms where 6 children and 2 adults were murdered as they slept. You've learned about a community forever changed by violence they couldn't comprehend or prevent. This isn't just a story. It's history. It's a documented case that generated thousands of pages of investigation, multiple trials, decades of speculation, and no resolution. The Moore family and the Stillinger sisters deserve to be remembered as more than victims of an unsolved crime. They were real people who lived real lives. Josiah Moore was a businessman who'd built success through hard work and determination. He employed people, served his community, provided for his family. Sarah Moore was a pianist, a mother, a homemaker who took pride in creating a clean, welcoming home for her husband and children. Herman, at 11, was on the cusp of adolescence, old enough to help with chores, young enough to still be a child. Mary Catherine, at 10, had friends she loved having over, a social life that revolved around school and church. Arthur, at 7, was in that wonderful age of curiosity and energy. And Paul, at 5, was still the baby, still being taught his letters and numbers, still dependent on his parents for everything. Lena and Ine Stillinger were sisters who came from a prosperous farming family. Lena, at 12, was entering those difficult years between childhood and young adulthood. Ine, at 8, was still firmly a child, excited about sleepovers and church programs and spending time with friends. They had parents who loved them, siblings who cared about them, futures that should have included graduations and weddings and children of their own. All of that was stolen on a single night by someone whose identity we will likely never know. And that's the tragedy that compounds the original tragedy. That the worst moment of their existence becomes the defining moment of their existence. That when people think of Josiah Moore, they think not of his business success or his family devotion, but of how brutally he died. That when people think of those 6 children, they think not of the lives they lived, but of the lives they didn't get to live. That's what murder does. It reduces people to victims, to statistics, to entries in case files and true crime documentaries. It steals not just their futures, but, in a sense, their pasts as well, by making everything they were subordinate to how they died. Thank you for listening to this story with the respect and attention it deserves. If you found this exploration of the Villisca Axe Murders compelling, I'd appreciate it if you'd take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are more stories like this, more dark corners of history that need to be examined, more mysteries that refuse to be solved. I'll be here, in the quiet spaces between the known and the unknown, ready to share them with you. Until next time, remember that some questions outlive the people who ask them. Some mysteries transcend the generations that tried to solve them. And some towns carry secrets that time cannot erase, only bury deeper beneath the passage of years. Villisca knows this truth better than most. The house at 508 East 2nd Street stands as a monument to unsolved horror, to justice denied, to 8 lives ended, and a killer who was never found. The pleasant view remains. But in the shadows, the question persists: who did this? And we may never know.